What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Bard is a champion that was designed around the idea of being a roaming support, similar to how Alistar was a roaming support back in the Season 1 meta. And with that design came one of the most unique characters in League of Legends to date, with voice lines consisting of only instruments, and abilities that interact with both allies and enemies. But before his release, Bard went through some numerous redesigns and other development cycles. So join me today in taking a look back at the time before his release, to see just what Bard could have been. As well, here's some of my favorite comments where I asked what you guys thought was the best ability in League. Today's question is, what's your favorite thing about Bard? Anyways, let's get started. The champion that would eventually become to be known as Bard began development in the summer of 2013, when Riot Skizix began pitching some early concepts and ideas to the design team, with the hopes of creating a champion from the folklore of the League of Legends universe. And that idea for a character proved to be a great one, as Bard would take shape visually in terms of art and how he looked quite early on in his development as a character, taking inspiration from the Hayao Miyazaki films, which are great films by the way. However, his personality and lore, and especially his gameplay, weren't so quick to come to life. Bard's original concepts intended for him to be a champion much more focused on music, both playing music and involving it in his abilities. This is where the name Bard eventually would come from in the first designs of his kit, because Bard was, well, a bard. He had a musical theme going for him and an instrument that was much more central to his abilities, kind of similar to Sona, I guess. He was going to be part of a single faction, but eventually it would be decided that it would make a lot more sense for him to be somewhat of an omnipotent being almost, void of any allegiance to factions in Runeterra, so that his character could exist in lore throughout the world, as a caretaker to protect relics and places scattered throughout. The decision to make him speak through musical energy was determined quite early on in his design and was maintained throughout his development. The variations of the original version of Bard, the musical version I guess you could say, involved a bunch of different kits and abilities. The first variation of Bard involved gameplay that was intended to be like a support for assassin players. He was a close-range trickster with a long-lasting stealth that he had to channel for a while to enter, like recall, and a directional knockback. He could clear the ward from his lane brush and then zone out the enemy team, and the idea is that if you ever lost sight of Bard, he would channel his stealth and just be gone, and with that came the pressure of his invisible presence. However, this first variation had a bunch of gameplay problems and it didn't really fit Bard's theme of being a musician very well at all, so it was scrapped completely. As for some of the more musical abilities that were attempted, one of them involved things such as a 3-charge single target skill shot that applied a stun on the final shot if you fired all 3 shots to a beat that was playing. This ability proved to be a lot of fun to mess around with, but was restrictive and limiting to use during actual gameplay. Another version involved a Guitar Hero style ultimate matching visual effects to a beat, but again, that ability sounds really cool, but it just didn't really work that well in the gameplay. However, Riot Meddler lead champion designer expressed the idea that a more subtle version of that kind of ability did have some potential to work. As well, a different version of Bard's musical kit that was tested had a passive that dropped a lay waste style effect under targets that Bard hit with an auto attack, with the effect detonating after a certain number of beats, similar to how Karthus' lay waste detonates after a short delay. This was the most promising and likely to be successful version of his musical kit, and Riot Meddler actually said that it wouldn't really surprise him at all if some variant of the ability eventually ended up on the future kit of a champion. And the last version that was tested during the time when Bard was designed as a musician involved a giant wave of slow-moving sound that gradually moved across the map, silencing enemies while they were within it. It had a width of about 1200 units and moved at a speed of about 600 units per second. Kind of comparable to Nami's ultimate I guess, but this spell would actually take about 5 seconds to reach the average teamfight, since it came from your Nexus, with the idea being that Bard was making the Nexus crystal resonate to emit a powerful tone. This ability looked awesome, but felt really random given how far in advance you had to cast it, which of course isn't really good gameplay for a silence, which is something that you would want to use a lot more reactively. Meddler commented on this ability too, saying that the slow-moving wave from one side of the map to the other still does have some promise, and he could imagine them revisiting that ability someday with a different effect on it on a different champion as well. The musical versions of his kit, although they were pretty cool, would prove to be a lot better on paper than in actual practice, and a lot of the variations of his kit felt restrictive or clunky to play with. Bard would go on to get iceboxed for a brief period of time until eventually they would decide to transform Bard from a musical bard into much more of a cosmetic being, and the design concepts of his abilities would change drastically. Riot wanted Bard to fit the idea of being this otherworldly celestial being, so a big part of bringing that character to life was to have a voiceover contain no actual spoken words, being made only with instruments. Early versions of his voiceover prototypes involved instruments such as the bassoon, the contrabassoon, and the bass clarinet. They also experimented and messed around with some sounds from loads of other things, like a bunch of Tibetan instruments and various versions of the trombone and cymbals, as well as various ethnic flutes and reed instruments too. Eventually, in the final version of his voiceover, they used 4 different things to bring it all together and give Bard this sense of otherworldliness: the alpenhorn, some Egyptian flutes, a verbed out piano tone of clusters and strings, and a synthesizer called Zebra, which they programmed to cycle through the harmonic or overtone series were used in Bard's voiceover. Although his musical theme remains a tiny bit in the form of his flute-like weapon and a musical voiceover, his kit would be changed to have pretty much no interaction with music. There was an earlier iteration of his concept where Bard was much more obsessed with wandering and roaming than he is now, and that design inspired his current collection passive involving Meeps. The roaming support concept remained true as well, and eventually Bard's kit was designed and finalized, and he was put onto the PBE. And I can honestly say that Bard has one of the most interesting and unique gameplay designs of any champion in League of Legends, with an incredibly fun kit and an awesome personality, and it's incredible to see how far he's come, and really just what Bard could have been. And that's just about it. If you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, and if you didn't hit the dislike, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.